friends, and welcome to Smartloving Conversations, the place where we discuss all things Catholic marriage. I'm Francine Parola.
And I'm Laura Kane from Smartloving, a global network that accompanies couples as we together explore how to maximise the good times and learn from the bad ones.
With our guests, we explore love, marriage, family, and living the Catholic faith, setting our sights on heaven while keeping our feet on the ground, or in the mud and muck that life throws our way. We've been there, and so have our guests.
Join us for better and for worse as we dive deep into real-life conversations of struggle and triumph.
Welcome, friends and listeners of Radio Maria Australia, to Smartloving Conversations. This episode, we're talking about our formation from our family of origin. So, Laura, what's your experience with this topic? Have you had much to do with thinking about this?
Yeah, well, when we sponsor Couples Friend through the Smartloving Engage program, this is lesson 3 of the course, and couples have really amazing feedback about it and they spend a lot of time on it. So it's a really important topic to explore both your families of origin and understand how that shapes and influences you and your marriage. So very important topic. I'm really excited to break it open with you.
Yeah, great.
So, Fran, how was, before we get into family of origin as a topic, how has your walk with the Lord been these past days? You've had a busy couple of weeks, I know.
Yeah. So I've just sort of on the downside of the Plenary Council Assembly here in Australia, which was a major event. There's a lot of media coverage and so on. Look, parts of that week, it was quite intense. The weather was just absolutely abysmal. It was just blustery, windy, rainy, umbrellas getting blown in and out, which is a little bit of a metaphor, I think, for just the nature of some of the discussions. It was quite tense, particularly at the beginning of the week. In some ways, I was a little bit traumatised by the politicisation of some of the discussions. But I've really just been leaning into the Jesus prayer, which is, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. I found that a real steadying influence for me, just to remind me that I'm not perfect in this. Not to avoid getting on my high horse and being judgmental, but just to stay in touch with, we're all travellers, in the words of Mary McKillop, we're all travellers here. We're all seeking to follow the Lord. We might have different opinions about it, but just have a little bit of humility around the judgments that I might be making around what was going on there. So, yes, that Jesus prayer has just been a godsend for me.
It's interesting, have mercy on me, as in the theme of mercy, because I was speaking to my old housemate yesterday and she'd just been on a trip to Poland for a wedding, and she's not religious, but she was showing me all her pictures from the trip and the highlights, and she stopped at a photo of a cake and it was a Polish cake, and she said, "Oh, Laura, you're going to love this story." And I saw the picture and I knew exactly what cake it was. So I excitedly interrupted her and I'm like, "Oh, that's kremówka." And she was laughing and she's like, "How did you know the name of that cake, this random Polish cake?" And I said, "Well, that was St. Pope John Paul's favourite cake. And when I went to Poland for World Youth Day, I had some." So that just reignited my interest in St. Pope John Paul and Sister Faustina. So I've been, and the Divine Mercy image and prayer, and so the chaplet. So I've been hanging out with Jesus' good mates, Sister Faustina and St. Pope John Paul, and just rereading their stories and wanting to be open to how God will work in my own story, life and marriage. So that's my walk with Jesus the last couple of days.
It's that whole message of divine mercy. It's just so liberating and so life-giving. I love it.
Absolutely. I was just going to say, it's just so remarkable too. Just you couldn't write a better story.
I agree. Shall we dive into it?
Let's dive into the topic.
So the influence of family of origin. So what I'm going to do is just unpack a couple of, I guess, almost, they're like principles upon which we can dissect and interpret the different aspects of how our family of origin, so that's really looking at our family from our childhood experiences and how it plays out in our marriages. The first point is really just to accept and recognise that we're influenced, that we're not as independent as we like to think we are. There's very strong cultural assumption in our society that, hey, I'm an adult, I make my own decisions. Well, we do to a certain extent, but there's a very strong subconscious influence that's coming through our family of origin, those early years, particularly in terms of the lens or how we interpret the events of our lives. And so therefore our family of origin is one of the most powerful influences. It kind of created the window frame through which subsequent experiences were perceived and interpreted. So, for example, an infant, one of the first things we, I guess, determine or perceive as an infant, even before we have language to form kind of words around it, is the world safe? And that can go back to even experiences within the womb. Some pregnancies take place in difficult circumstances. Our early interactions as a toddler, whether we were comforted, with appropriately, and when we had a caregiver who was responsive to our needs and our pleas for when we had needs that hunger and sleep and so on. That all creates, I guess, a perception around: is this world safe? Am I safe here? As an example. And that's happening all the way through our early childhood years. We're forming, I guess, a worldview based on our experiences in those younger years. So when it comes to our formation for marriage, one of the most powerful influences is our parents. They were the most readily accessible role model for marriage. And that came through really observation of our parents and how they interacted with each other. That applies even if we came from a home life or a situation where one parent was not there, either through death or a single parent sort of formation of a family or divorce or so on. There was still the role of the parents, the role of the primary caregivers that were very significant in terms of modelling for us what marriage looks like. So it might sometimes have been perhaps it wasn't our direct parent, but it might have been grandparents or uncles and aunts or the neighbours that would have formed our kind of ideas around, well, how do the husband and wife behave towards each other? Now, one of the things that couples often say to us when we come to this topic is, particularly if they're very devoted Christians, is they'll have some resistance to, I guess, looking into this topic, because the Bible is really clear around honouring our parents, honouring our mother and father. And so we'd like to just point out that it's really important to remember that we're formed by our perception, not by the reality. So to just give you an example of how we saw this playing out with our own children, my husband Byron overheard our then young son, Chris, I think he was maybe 6 or 7, telling his younger brother, "Daddies don't cry." As Byron kind of says, well, actually, he does cry. He does cry, but that hadn't been Christopher's experience. Christopher had never seen him cry. So therefore, his conclusion was daddies don't cry in an absolute sort of sense. So it wasn't the reality, but it was his perception that was forming him in that idea that daddies don't cry. We see the same thing sometimes when we have siblings doing these activities and they've come from the same family, but they'll draw quite different conclusions about what was happening in their family of origin. I don't know, Laura, if you've got any kind of examples or experiences of that phenomenon happening.
Yes, I do. I have an example where perception was more influential than reality. My own family of origin, my father's retired now, but he owned a hairdressing salon for most of my life. And now, if you work in a service industry, think hairdresser, chef, you own a retail store, Thursday nights, Saturdays, and Sundays, it's your busiest time periods. So you just have to be there as a business and as an owner, otherwise, you just won't survive. So my middle brother, James, he is and was excellent at sports. He's very good at athletics, talented at soccer. So he really shined on the sports field. And my brother and his wife and I were chatting and reminiscing about our childhood. And he shared that he felt quite sad that dad could not be there on those Saturday and Sundays when he would win a medal, break a record, or his team got to the finals. And now I also had important sporting moments, but I didn't feel sad that dad was not on the sidelines because I was aware if dad was not running the business and if he was not there at the salon, we wouldn't have the money to play the sport. So mum was always there watching and recording and taking photos and reporting back. And she was full time at home with us. And that was largely due to dad being at the salon most of the time. Also, I think because I would also be in the salon as a young girl, I would stay and sweep up the hair, answer the phones, and I would witness and hear dad singing the praises to the clients, to the ladies' hairs he was doing about how his children were marvelous and had broken this record and kicked this goal. so I could sense that he wanted to be there and desired to be there, and marveled in our talents and seeing us evolve. So he was, and I witnessed, mum being like, "Oh, it's your father ringing again to get reports on the day." So I was saying back to James and kind of defending what I experienced in my reality of dad. And I was saying, yes, but mum was there representing the both of them and reporting back. And so that was interesting to just hear James's perspective versus my perspective, and how we both felt about that. So my brother was now then saying that he's got his own kids and he wanted to make sure he didn't miss any sporting moments because of his work. And so we were just debating whether that was reasonable and and achievable, I guess. So yeah, that's a good example of how the
the
perceptions are
different
quite
perception.
yes.
Yeah. And it's really not uncommon. We hear that a lot, that siblings compare notes. They'll often have taken away very different interpretations of what was really happening in their parents' relationship, in their families. And it's so it really is a very unique activity, I suppose, that each couple, each individual has to kind of really take that journey themselves to understand that influence in their lives. So that's the first kind of point, I suppose. The second point I'd just like to make is that there's two different modes that's really helpful when we're thinking about formation in terms of our marriages. Two different two different modes to look at. One is the marital role model. So I've already alluded to this. And this basically we will form through observation of our parents relating to each other. How do husbands or wives behave? What's normal? What are their roles? For example, in the distribution of household chores, which would have been happening before our eyes, for example. Even when there's an absent parent, other figures, such as the way mum might have interacted with a new partner or a stepfather or so on, or grandparents, can kind of create those sense of impressions or those belief systems around this is what is normal for a family, this is how families operate. The second mode is what I would call direct interaction. So this was through our relationship with each of our parents. And each parent has different sort of role. Our same-sex parent, so for me as a woman, it would be my relationship with my mum, was really, I think, quite important and influential in terms of messages around puberty and sex education and so on, because that tends to be one of the things that the same-sex parent takes on as a particular responsibility in the forming of their children. And that can be quite significant in terms of the messaging that comes through, the sense of celebration and joy and acceptance of our human sexuality versus negativity and so on. So that's one area that we think is a really good one to just reflect on. And then with our other sex parent, this is quite an interesting one and a little bit counterintuitive, because sometimes that's really where I, as a woman, practiced being a woman in relationship to another man. So my dad is the most significant man in my life in those early years. And until I met Byron, he was the most significant man. And so and research tells us that relationship that we have with our parent of the other sex is really important in terms of influencing our mate selection. So we tend to be attracted subconsciously to a future mate who in some way relates to us in similar ways to what our parent, because that's what we're used to, right? I've been relating to my dad in a particular pattern, and so when Byron comes along and there's similarities in the way he relates to me, it feels really comfortable and right, and there's a sort of a sense of ease about that sort of relationship. So that can be a really good one to just, I guess, keep in the back of our minds. Do you have experiences of similar kind of dynamic happening for you, Laura?
I think my dad and Joseph, my husband, are both very hardworking, and so that was attractive. And they get their energy from people, so they are both very talkative, whereas they're not shy males, and they could talk more than me. Good communicators.
I can verify that.
And there are differences, though. My dad is a bit more creative and messy, whereas Joe has to have everything in its place and quite structured. So when the plan gets changed unexpectedly, Joe can get quite frustrated. And I've said before, oh, I wish you were more like my dad. When things don't go to plan, just laugh it off and relax and go with the flow. So there's similarities and differences, which you have to get used to when in early marriage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so just one last little idea just to plant in the minds of our listeners before we go to a break. The third point is really to then think about, well, how do we react to that formation? And there's two typical reactions. The first one is what we call we adopt the formation, or we adopt the ideas. And that's like almost like a mannerism or a gesture, or sometimes we get like family mottos or sayings that perhaps our father or mother kind of says, or grandparents say all the time. And it kind of it's a passive acceptance that sort of happens really in a very subconscious sort of way. But the other way we react sometimes is in radically opposite, in a rejection. So there's like an active resistance. We see something happening or experience something in our family of origin and we decide we don't want to be like that. It's somehow caused us pain, or we made a judgment. So like your brother would be a good example. Dad wasn't at the sideline. That's what we would call a rejection of that formation. I'm going to be there for every game kind of thing. Another good just general example is around religious belief. We see that often. Some children, as they grow up to adults, they accept the religious traditions and beliefs of their family of origin, and others reject it quite dramatically. Now, the point about it is whatever we decide to react to it, are we acting in freedom? Because adopting it without thinking about it, we're just sort of kind of going on an autopilot. That's not the ideal. It's much better to be intentional. Or even if we're reacting, we think we're making a choice against it, but sometimes it's because we're acting out of a woundedness. And so there's a sense of compulsivity about it. There's not really a freedom there. So adopt it or reject it, it's the decision is ours, but the point is, are we acting in freedom? And if there's, either a sort of an ignorance or a lack of awareness of what we're doing, or there's just this compulsive thing, neither of those are really free. So part of the process of analysing our family of origin is so that we can actually make some conscious choices around that.
Let's take a quick break and we'll come back to explore how our family of origin plays out in the day-to-day. Welcome back to Smartloving Conversations. We've been talking today about the influence of our family of origin, and we're ready to go deeper and explore how it plays out in our marriages.
Most of the formation that we get from our families is positive and it's helpful. And it's really important for us to acknowledge that. Sometimes we can just sort of drift through life. And we've actually, probably most of how we're operating in our families is been good formation. It's been a really positive and helpful, and we just adopt it without really understanding, hey, there's actually an alternative. So that's not the case in every family. So I think it's helpful to sometimes just step back a little bit and identify, hey, I got that from mum and dad's example, and that's a really good thing. And I'm embracing that and making the choice around it. And by the way, thanks, mum and dad. So an example for me would be just the witness of my parents to lifelong commitment. I did see them as a child, sometimes arguing, but we also saw them making up. So we had an example of a couple that were very consciously trying to develop and nurture their relationship, each of my siblings, my brother and sister, and that was very kind of apparent to us. Well, that's a great thing for me to say that's a good value. And, and to thank them for that when the opportunity arises. What about you? Have you got something from your background that you can think of?
Yes, one positive thing I took from my own formation was that Dad was really the one who put the importance on the faith. So he was the Catholic figure, and my mum was Church of England. My mum actually became Catholic when we were teenagers, but every Sunday Dad would make sure we were at Mass, and then we would also in the evening have a family rosary with my extended family, aunts and uncles. And so when I was dating Joe, I had said to him, his family of origin, his mother was the Catholic and the dad was Christian, non-Catholic but evangelical. So when dating Joe, I said, look, I want you to be the spiritual leader. So I want you to become more active in your faith. So that was a thing from my family of origin. And I had read how important it was that the father take interest in the faith. If any children come along, it's really important that the father is a faithful spiritual leader.
Really true. That father influence is obviously mums play a big role in that as well. But you're right. The research does show that the father has impact on the next generation is stronger. their example in the faith. Okay, so that's positive formation. Now we want to just look at problem formation, and we encourage our couples to look at 3 different ways that formation can become problematic. The first one is really easy. Everybody gets it. It's just incompatible expectations. So in one household, the husband was exposed to this sort of idea, and in the other household, the wife's family of origin was different. So an example from my life is our father's working hours. My dad was a retail chemist, pharmacist, so it was regular shop hours, Thursday nights and Saturday mornings, no Sunday trading back in those days, but it was pretty predictable. He closed up the shop at 5:45. He was home by 6:05. Dinner was on the table by 6:30. So there was a regularity in the routine. Whereas Byron's father was a doctor and he worked in a hospital and he had rounds to do after hours. He sometimes was rostered on Christmas Day and public holidays. So the hours were much more unpredictable. And that was his norm. So we came into marriage with 2 very different expectations around what was the normal sort of working hours for the breadwinner to do. And I was deeply confused and distressed when Byron would be late home from work night after night after night, and he couldn't really understand what was the big deal. This is just what dads do. This is what the breadwinner does.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting. Well, my example in my own family of incompatible expectations that I took into marriage was mum was trained in banking before she became a full-time mum. So she took charge of all our family finances and documentation of the family. So dad earned the money from running the hairdressing salon and being the face of that and on the tools. And mum managed all the investments, the paperwork, and paid the staff, the bills, etc. So I was expecting to do the same as my mum in our marriage, but that was an incompatible expectation. I wasn't trained in accounting. I wasn't going to be any better at Joe at doing it. So we both needed to be aware of what was going on financially and make investment decisions together about, the mortgage and things like that.
Good example. Good example. So the next type of problem, so that's incompatible expectations. The next type of problem formation is a little bit harder to get your mind around, and we call this compatible but suboptimal. And sometimes it can be obvious and other times it's really subtle. So let me just give you an obvious example. For example, that you both came from families where the dad was an alcoholic. You would have compatible, like that's the same expectation, that's the same family experience. Mums react in this way, dads do it when dads are drinking too much. So you've got that dynamic between mum and dad around this. But I think we could all see that it's a suboptimal. It's not the ideal to be having either parent drinking too much or dependent on alcohol or drugs. You could look at it with violence or with infidelity or a divorce, for example. We know that children that are raised in families where there's been a lot of marriage breakdown, that is not the optimal. But it's the same. The thing is, it's going to seem like normal to them because they've got it from both families. So a more subtle one that I could point to in my history is, again, just going back to that example of arguments and making up. We both got strong formation in both families around the importance of forgiveness and of reconciling as a couple. But what we often missed or didn't see was that actual process that our parents undertook to come to that place of forgiveness. And the message that both of us, Byron and I, took away from our families in the two different households, which were very similar in the formation, is that forgiveness was the primary goal, and we would jump to forgiveness when we had hurt each other without ever really exploring or understanding what had caused the hurt in the first place. So we found ourselves having the same argument over and over again because we never actually discussed it and resolved it. We just kind of went to, hey, I'm supposed to forgive you, so I'm going to forgive you straight away, even though you've got no idea what you just did that hurt me, and I don't feel like I've got the right to tell you what that is. So that was an example, I suppose, of a compatible formation, but it was playing out suboptimally in our marriage because we didn't get the fullness of the picture of what was involved.
Great example, Fran.
Yeah, it's a little bit more subtle because it's actually, you don't look at it and say, oh, well, that was a negative behaviour or a negative example from the parents. It's actually a good example of formation from our parents. But the problem is that we weren't getting the fullness of the picture.
Yes.
So that's, again, it's one of those things a little bit more subtle, but worth reflecting on because it can be causing problems and difficulties in your relationship in a way that's not you're really aware of. The third type of problem formation is what we call emotional injuries. So these can be actions or events, emissions or exposure to trauma or whatever that we're just exposed to in our growing up. And the reality is our parents are limited. They're sinful, they make mistakes. We lose our temper as a parent. I can tell you I've done that many times. And so those kinds of experiences that my children have with me or I had with my parents can cause an emotional injury and a harm to the delicate psychology and the emotional life, the spiritual life of the child. And that then predisposes us, I suppose, to it's a vulnerability that we carry into our adult relationships. And so I guess an example of that again for me is that through my father's line, his father and then dad and then to me, there was just, a culture of criticism. There was this sort of perfectionism that manifested with comments around, well, you might get 95% in a maths test, but it'll be what happened to the 5% kind of comment, that sort of focusing on the deficit all the time. And that was something that I adopted and carried into my marriage, and it was really quite hurtful to Byron. It was always looking at the negative or the deficit rather than looking at the bigger picture and saying, oh, wow, you got 95%. That's amazing. Yeah. You got an example from emotional injury?
I do, yeah. So I have an emotional injury that Joe is aware of and has popped up in our marriage. It was a result of one of my best friends in early primary school saying that she did not want to be my best friend anymore. And it sounds trivial as a, 30-something-year-old to talk about it, but this really broke my heart at the time and it left a deep emotional injury. And it just raised big questions for my little young mind and heart, like, how can someone love you and be your best friend and then just one day say that they're not your best friend anymore? And it goes to the heart of your sense of self and that you are loved and lovable. So, this emotional injury has played out in our marriage, especially as we've been trying to have children for many years with no success. And in my downer moments, I've said things and thought things like, if we never have kids, are you going to get fed up of me and not love me anymore? And Joe was quite shocked to hear me ask that question and to say that. So we dug a little deeper and used, the wonderful tools we learnt in Smartloving to reflect on those feelings. And I realized it was linked to this emotional injury from my childhood, mixed with the trauma of infertility too, I'm sure. But part of, I guess, being a Christian and Catholic and knowing Jesus is knowing that you're loved by God no matter what, and that what I have been realizing as well through my marriage, and your marriage is a reflection, or it should be a reflection of that love that God has for you, that, Joe will love me. God loves me forever and always, and Joe will too. So that's, an emotional injury that it pops up in strange times and places in our marriage.
Yeah, and plays out with quite significant consequences. And it's a good example, actually. I mean, we've been focusing very much on the parents and the influence of the parents, but there's anything that happens in our childhood can really have long-term impact. And so we'll often say to people, if they're not sort of getting any traction on, I can't understand where this is coming from, we'll often say, well, what about your relationship with your grandparents or your siblings? Because sometimes they can be really influential, or in this case, your best friend was very, very significant in setting, I guess, planting a seed of unworthiness that then was manifesting and being triggered later on down the track.
Yeah, 100%. It's so important to be self-aware and understand what's happened.
Yeah. Thanks for trusting us with that story, Laura. It's really, really profound, and we probably need to take a quick break now. So we'll have a little song and then we'll be back soon.
Hello and welcome back. You're listening to Smartloving Conversations on Radio Maria Australia. We've been talking about the influence of our family of origin on our marriages, and now it's time to get practical.
So we've covered some of the background principles of family of origin and tried to give you kind of, I guess, some tools and some frameworks around how to interpret what's going on and break it down. The question we want to do now is, that's been looking back into the past. Now we want to look at how does it play out in the present. how do we decode those family of origin factors that arise in situations of conflict and tension in our marriage today, on a day-to-day basis. And immediately my mind's going to many situations that Byron and I have had in our life where we're just kind of doing life. It might be a Saturday morning, we've woken up, everything's going great, we're feeling loving and close to each other, we're having some nice breakfast or going for a walk or whatever, and then all of a sudden something happens. Byron says something or I say something, and it's like we're just ambushed. It's like blindsided by a rush of negative emotion that comes up, and all of a sudden we're on edge with each other and feeling unloved. And I guess that's a classic sort of situation that many couples can relate to, that sort of sense of, hey, I've just been triggered. Where did this come from? Give you a little example of this. So we call it our espresso cups example. A couple of years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we got a new espresso machine, and it came with an extra bonus set of espresso cups. Now, at the time, nobody in our family was drinking espresso. We were all having lattes and cappuccinos. So I put the espresso cups in the back of the cupboard for future use. About a year later, some guests come over and one of them wanted an espresso. No problem. I'm making the coffees. I'm digging around the back of the cupboard. Can't find the espresso cups. I'm checking the drawers. I'm trying the next shelf down. Where are the espresso cups, Byron? And he says, oh, I threw them out because we weren't using them.
Byron.
Oh my gosh. I was so triggered. I was so emotionally aroused. I was furious. And I guess one of the clues straight away is that there was this irrationality about it. Even though he'd told me he'd thrown them out, I kept looking in the cupboard, expecting them to magically appear. So that was kind of like, I guess, the arousal and the feeling emotionally very upset was the first clue. And the second one was this irrational disbelief, kind of magical thinking going on, that was signs that there was something much deeper going on. So what can you do about it? Well, sometimes in the heat of the situation, you just have to hold it together. And that's a part of a mature emotional life where we don't just give in to our kind of emotional demands and let them run away and drive our life and cause all sorts of chaos. But later, after our guests had left, I took it to prayer and I sat down and just used what we call our time out to ask why tool. So time out to ask why. When I'm reacting strongly or feeling irritated with the other, it's a bit of a time out. So step back from the situation, step back from the person, the husband or the wife or the boss or the friend or whoever it is that's triggering you, and ask why. Why am I reacting this way and where is this coming from? And when I did this, I got some really important insights. It took me straight back to my childhood and my relationship with my dad, who is a bit of a neatnik. He likes order, and he had a very strong routine every evening. He would take the garbage out, and before he took the garbage out, he'd do a sweep of the family spaces, and he'd pick up all the bits of half-finished drawings or homework or trinkets or whatever, and he'd throw them out. And there was a couple of times when he threw out things that were really precious to me. They weren't necessarily valuable. They were just precious to me. They were toys or things that he thought I no longer needed or I'd grown out of, drawings that I hadn't finished or, a favourite pencil or something like that. And it felt like such a violation that I had no sense of agency around the things that were mine and that were precious to me, that he didn't respect that. And of course, Byron had stepped on that landmine. It was sitting there as a wound beneath the surface, like a landmine that you can't even see, not even aware of. And all of a sudden he stepped on it and it's just blown up in our faces and faces of our poor guests. But it allowed me, using that little tool, the time out to ask why, allowed me firstly to analyse what was going on, see the roots in my family of origin, the emotional injury from my dad, and then also kind of to take steps to process that, take it to prayer, forgive my dad for his limitations. I can laugh now. It's still a little bit tender, but I can laugh now. He's still doing it. He's still throwing out my mum's stuff, and my poor mum just sort of says, Dad said I can't keep this, can you use it? It's part of his character and his, the way he operates, so we can kind of embrace that with tenderness and without it kind of really hurting as much as it might otherwise.
Yeah.
What about you, Laura? You got an example?
I have, we call it the onion story. Not the espresso cup story.
I'm
So
already
true.
crying.
True story. We had a fight over the way Joe cut an onion, and it's funny but embarrassing to talk about. But this is a really good example of that self-awareness and, the time out to ask why tool coming into effect. So if I can explain the context of what happened, if Joe says
You can
something,
start digging yourself a hole. Be
I
my
know.
guest.
um, if Joe says he likes something to do with his meals, I pay attention, right? Smart loving, store it in my brain. So, for instance, if he likes chili flakes on his pizza or whatnot. So, I'm usually the meal prepper in our house. Not always, but most of the time. So, I went through a stage of making Greek salads and preparing them in mason jars for the days ahead. So, I showed Joe one time how I liked to cut up all the ingredients: cucumber, tomato, feta, olives, onion, and the certain way that I like to prep it and cut it. And so Joe listened and watched, and that was that. So fast forward a few weeks later, and I wasn't feeling very well, so Joe had to prepare the meal that evening, grilled chicken with a Greek salad. So he had a go at the way that, cutting up all the ingredients. And the way he cut the onion that particular day was not the way I had showed him. So I slice it quite thinly so that you don't get, an overwhelming taste of onion. And Joe had cut it in these really thick onion chunks. And so he puts the meal in front of me, and I was trying to eat this dinner and not say anything, but I was really annoyed, and I couldn't hold my tongue any longer, and I had to say something. So I brought it up and I said, "Look, a few weeks ago I showed you how I liked all the ingredients to be prepared, and you've cut the onion and you've done it a different way, and as a result, it's really spoilt my meal, and I'm feeling really annoyed right now, and I just want you to know, because if I'm acting frosty, that's why." So now poor Joe, he's super hurt. He feels super unappreciated. He's made this meal, and I've just gone and criticized the way he's cut the onion, and I'm not showing appreciation for all the rest of the things he's done that day. Really dumb loving. And he was caring for me really well when I wasn't feeling good, and he's just done this little thing that's stepped on an emotional landmine for me. So we were both upset with each other. So we took 30 minutes to calm down, and I used the tool, the timeout to ask why tool. And I was reflecting, why am I so annoyed that he chopped the onion like that? I could have just picked off all the onion and sliced it myself. It would have taken 2 minutes. What is wrong with me? Instead, I've spoilt the whole dinner by not being able to keep my mouth shut. So I think the answer, when I took that to prayer and was reflecting on it, was that in that moment, I felt that Joe did not love me.
Mm.
My thinking went, well, I take the time to remember the way he likes his food prepared and the way he likes his food cut up. No, but he doesn't like butter on his sandwiches, chili flakes on his pizza, whatever. And in my mind at that moment, I thought he didn't care enough about me and to remember the way I liked my onion sliced in my Greek salad. And so I reacted really strongly. It wasn't just the onion, it was the way it made me feel and my perception, not the
Mm.
reality.
So it
So
had symbolic meaning, and it was the meaning you were associating with the action. Because you're right, it feels so trite and so silly. It's
I
like,
know.
goodness sakes, the cups, they hadn't been used, in a year. Why would it bother me that we'd thrown them out? But there's that symbolic,
Yes.
I guess, meaning to it, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it really goes deep.
Yeah, and telling back that story, I feel like I sound crazy, but with self-awareness, and also I think that emotional injury from childhood that I mentioned before, my best friend saying that they did not want to be my friend anymore, does Joe still love me? Does he still care enough to make note of the small little things that I like? And I think that's why I reacted so strongly. So we can look back at it now and laugh and use it as an example of, yeah, you've got a time out to ask why tool. It's brilliant.
Yeah, so true. I'm just thinking, listening to you talk, the image that I get in my mind on this family of origin stuff is like the attic in your house. And we put into those attic spaces all the trash and the treasure of our past. There's grandma's old sewing machine, there's old toys, some of them are broken, but some of them were really precious. That's, the overloved teddy that's all disgusting and gross, but you can't get rid of it because it was so precious. Photo albums, your wedding dress, whatever. It's all kind of sitting up in the attic. Some of it's trash and some of it's treasure. But it's underneath. We're living in the rooms underneath, and we're not even aware of the influence that stuff is having on us and on our thoughts and feelings and reactions until there's this trigger, and it's like the roof falls in, And suddenly there's your dad's voice in your ear or your friend from childhood saying something hurtful. That's just bringing everything up in a big rush again. And that image just comes to me over and over again as we're doing life together, feeling like, oh my gosh, there's this history that sits above us, and we're living underneath and we don't even know. We're not even aware that it's influencing us half of the time, most of the time.
Yeah, that's a really good visual metaphor, Fran. We'll take a quick break now before we come back with some Smart Loving Q&A.
Hi there, friends. This is Radio Maria Australia, and it's time for a Smart Loving Q&A. We get questions every day from wives, husband and couples from around the world. So what have you got for us, Laura, for this week?
So this is a question from Amanda, and she asks, we've been married for 1.5 years and my husband just got a promotion, so he's working longer hours. My job is less demanding, so I'm usually home before him. And when he does get home, it's late and he's tired and he doesn't really want to talk with me. I'm feeling really lonely and starting to doubt that I made the right decision to marry him. How can I reconnect with him? So, Amanda, that's really tough. Thank you for sharing, your thoughts. Look, just some things I would comment on. If your husband just got a promotion, I would imagine he's probably working longer hours, getting used to the new role to make sure he's also seen to be doing a good job in that new role at work. So I would expect and hope it would settle down as he gets used to the role and gets faster at the new responsibilities. But I'm just want to reassure you because I'm sure he wants to spend time with you, but he may have an inherent need to be a strong provider for the family financially. And I think a lot of men would feel that way too. So, a good question would be to ask, if you look at his family of origin, was his dad a really hard worker and was he away from home a lot due to his job? And what about your own dad? Maybe your own father could have had a different role and was regularly home on time. So, your own husband may be thinking that, this is what husbands do and it's the best way to love you by helping to provide for you and for your home. So, and in the meantime, you're feeling unloved. So, I guess you need to make sure that you're getting the emotional intimacy you need. So, there's a great question that you can ask each other. And that is, at the end of the day, you can ask, what was your strongest emotion of the day, honey? That's a really good question. It will allow you to get an insight into his day. And then you can share your strongest emotion of the day and without overwhelming him with telling him everything you're feeling and all your thoughts. Whereas if he's tired, he may not have that energy, emotional energy to give to you. So you could also team that question up with a connect kiss for 20 seconds and a connect hug. And that's just really practical way to connect with each other physically and emotionally. So another thing is, and I know you may not want to do it, but just to try and show your appreciation to him. So, hey, honey, I just want to acknowledge and appreciate the fact you're working long hours for the family. And I'm so proud you got that promotion. You're brilliant and you're obviously being recognized for that brilliance. So just appreciating him as a man and his talents, I think he'll feel really loved. It would be a good example of smart loving. You could also say, look, I know you must be exhausted after your day, but could we make sure we have a few minutes each night to connect with one another? I would love some quality time with you to check in and share how both our days were. So perhaps start there and see how you go. And I'm sure Fran will have some comments to add on to that too, some tips.
Oh, you've covered it so comprehensively, but I do relate to the question because that's been very much our story as well. And the reality is that marriage can be lonely when you've got that big disparity in working hours, and one particularly is investing a lot outside the home, and especially like I was the primary carer of our children, so I was investing a lot in the home. And so it can be lonely for both of you, but we tend to, I guess, get more absorbed with our own experience and become less aware of how the other might be feeling. So your tips there, Laura, are really good for that. And I suppose the only other thing that I would add is just to remember that at the end of the day, the call of marriage is to love the other person. And ideally that will be mutual, but there will be seasons in our life where one is giving more than the other. It's not going to be, we never like to use the term 50-50, but I'd rather say 100-100, because really that's the commitment. The commitment is to give 100%, not just only give as much as the other person is giving. But the reality is, in the seasons of marriage, there will be ebbs and flows, and to just kind of be able to carry, sometimes you can be at peace with carrying our husband, or sometimes he's carrying you. And just to bring that all to the Lord and let the Lord sanctify that kind of sacrifice that you make for your own needs in order to serve your husband. It's a sort of pretty important lesson for the long journey, I think. Otherwise, you can come undone very easily as a couple.
Well, if you've got questions for us, you can contact us via the Radio Maria website or by visiting www.smartloving.org/conversations.
Now it comes to our last little bit before we sign off, which is just our bless you. And we'd like to obviously share with you, our listeners, some of the things that have blessed us in our life. And so I might just go first, Laura. One of the things that's been a great blessing in my life over the last couple of years has been the Unbound Prayer Ministry, which is a deliverance prayer format. It's hosted by the Heart of the Father Ministries. And I just encountered it as a participant about 2 years ago, and then I did the training. And it's just been transformative in terms of bringing the things that are happening in my life and putting them on the altar before the Lord and letting the Lord shape me and heal me in very practical ways. I'm the kind of personality, I like a little bit of structure and a framework, and this is a prayer format that just gives us 5 principles around how to kind of move towards a healing and towards encountering the Father's love more powerfully. So I've just found it's such a gift in my life, and we'll pop a link on our webpage for people who want to find out more about that.
Thanks for sharing that, Fran. My bless you for this Smart Loving Conversations is these beeswax wraps that
Love
you
it.
can use. And I know, Fran, you used to have a hive of bees, so you love all things, bees and honey and all the amazing things that they produce. So yeah, these beeswax wraps, you can use them instead of like single-use plastic wrap to wrap up your sandwiches or cover up an avocado or cover a bowl of food. So I got a few of them and I've been loving them. So I'd like to share that with our listeners. And if you see any at the shops, grab yourself some because they're good to have.
Yeah, and just by coincidence, one of Byron's cousins makes like a kit where you can buy the wax bar and the cloth, and then you kind of grate it on. And it's a little bit messy. I have bought a couple of kits to support her business. It's a little bit messy, but you can now. I'm noticing they're turning up in a lot of the shops, the supermarkets. I think Aldi might have been selling them a few weeks ago. So
Yes.
they are a nice organic alternative to the plastic wrap.
Yeah.
Just don't put them in the microwave. They're not good in the microwave.
No, don't put them in the microwave for sure. They're okay in the fridge though.
Yes, they're good in the fridge. Good in the fridge. Great for things like cheese and stuff, because it allows a little bit of breathing so it doesn't sort of mold, but also stops them drying out. It's kind of just that really good organic food preservation.
Yeah, good for the environment too, which is good to care for
yes.
our common home.
Yeah,
The Dato Sea.
And we love our bees. I just love reflecting on the whole colony of bees and how they work as a social unit that is within the hive. I do like to remind men that most hives, they're primarily girls, females, and the females do all the work. The drones, which are the males, they've only really got one job, and that's to impregnate or fertilise a queen from another hive. Like, they don't actually serve any function to the hive that they're in that sustains them, which is why the drones generally get killed off for the winter months, and because the girls do all the work. But they've got an incredibly self-sacrificing kind of approach. They work together for the good of the hive. So there's kind of some really good messages for us to reflect on and take home from our girls working hard in the beehive, not only producing beautiful honey for us to enjoy, but also working hard to preserve the common good and the common wealth of the hive itself. That brings us to the end of our time, Laura. So it's been great spending it with you, our listeners. You can find more information about Smart Loving, including links to our blessings, the show notes and more at smartloving.org/conversations. That's www.smartloving.org/conversations. We're Francine Parola and Laura Kane from Smart Loving, and we pray that you will be blessed in your walk with the Lord today, and we lift you up and all your attentions to our patron saints, Our Lady Undura of Knots, pray for us, and St John Paul II, pray for us. This is Radio Maria Australia. Goodbye.